This video is powered by Patreon. More on that later on in the video. The entire nation is fighting through an intense civil war, except one side has something that gives them a bit of an advantage. We start things off with the nation of Patria, in the midst of a civil war due to a new energy source being discovered, known as Somnium. It's the Northern Union up against the Southern Confederacy. Where have I heard that one before? The war is currently being dominated by the South as they far outnumber the North. We then cut to a battlefield, in which the Northern Union is attempting to attack a fortified stronghold held by the South. After a not-so-successful initial charge, a shell-shocked soldier watches a group, clad in white, walking towards the fort, when the leader of the group tells them to commence the attack, and we see them all begin to transform into mythical beasts, which, surprise surprise, allows them to completely break through the defenses of the fort and destroy the enemy base. You know, if the southern troops attacked them here, when they were out in the open, completely defenseless, this might have gone a bit better for them. After the battle, we learn that the Northern Union has turned to using forbidden technology in order to give them an edge in the war. These soldiers that they use are known as incarnates. Later that night, the leader of the incarnates, Hank, meets his childhood friends Kane and Elaine in a tent, where we discover that Elaine is the scientist who discovered the method of creating incarnates in the first place, and is now trying to find a method in which she can reverse the process. Moving forward, we then get a montage of the incarnates, ensuring victory after victory for the North, until eventually, after the victory of one battle, this snake-looking dude, Abai, goes completely insane, attacking both allies and enemies. Hank runs up to Abai and asks him why he's doing this, when he turns to him, telling him it's not him in control, pleading for help. The Northern troops then open cannon fire onto him, which forces him to revert back to his human form. As Hank demands a medic to try and help him, Abai, scared of no longer being in control and being a danger to his team, takes his own life. Afterwards, morale understandably drops in the group of incarnates, and during the funeral for their comrade, Hank tells his troops that there's a possibility that what happened to Abai could happen to any one of them, and makes them all swear an oath that they will kill any of their members who lose their humanity if something similar happens again. After fighting continues on for many weeks, losing members along the way, they finally reach the southern capital. And while giving a pep talk to his troops, who are suffering from low morale, he tells them that after this is all over, he's going to ask Elaine to be with him, and he orders all of them to celebrate with him, so they have to make it back alive. Later that night, Elaine meets with Hank just outside the camp, wanting to talk to him. She admits to him that the battle tomorrow will most likely be called off just as it begins, as negotiations on a ceasefire have been going back and forward between the North and the South in secret, and the country will most likely become unified again without any more bloodshed. Hank begins to think about the soon approaching peace, when Elaine says, "Yeah, about that," turning around with tears in her eyes, pointing that thing at Hank, shooting him in the side with a special god-killer bullet. She tells him that she couldn't figure out a way to return incarnates back to humans, and that they will all eventually become beasts, becoming a greater threat than the Civil War ever was, admitting that this is the only way to save them. Yeah, I think just not shooting them might be a better way to save them, but that's just me. Just then, her co-conspirator Kane shows up, and she hands him a gun with more god-killer ammo. He is going to help her eliminate the rest of the squad, before they then commit suicide. But then Kane, unwilling to give up his powers, hits Elaine with the reverse Uno, shooting and killing her. Hank then awakens 2 months later from a coma, where he is told by an intelligence agent named Liza that the war is over, and the surviving incarnates have spread out across the entire continent, and are now wreaking havoc in their beast forms. She then informs him that Elaine's body was never found, and Hank swears to complete the oath he made with his troops, to kill any of them who have lost their humanity. We then cut to an orphanage sometime during the war, being run by a man named William John Bancroft, with his daughter, Charles. We find out that both the village and the orphanage are quite poor, due to the civil war going on. One day, after making their way back to the orphanage after a failed hunting mission, Union officers are waiting at the front door for them, where they later have a conversation with Will and subsequently draft him into the war. When he tells Charles, she is furious, but he explains to her that there is apparently something special about him, and if he goes, the village and the orphanage will receive funding from the government, which will help everyone. As he goes to leave, Charles promises to him that she will be waiting here for him to return. We then cut forward to shortly after the war had ended. A large brown dragon walks into town, which sounds like the start of a really bad joke, but they are all told by the Union soldiers that this is William John Bancroft, and he is now stuck in his incarnate form permanently. Hey, having a dragon for a dad can't be too bad, can it? Despite the change of appearances, everyone welcomes him back with open arms, declaring him a war hero. A short time after they settle into the new dynamic, Will begins to scream out in the middle of the night, which not only troubles the orphans, but also the local villagers. After this occurring for a while, the villagers then begin to complain to Charles that their cows and livestock have been found dead, completely torn to shreds, accusing her father of being the culprit. And due to his worsening state, they also take the children away from the orphanage, as it's not safe for them anymore. Later that night, Charles is awoken by gunfire. and upon racing outside to see what's going on, she finds Hank standing over her father's wounded body, before Hank, using the God-Killer ammo, kills Will before walking away, leaving Charles to grieve in the rain. Having nothing left for her now, she takes her father's elephant gun and leaves to track down Hank, who she actually finds absurdly quick, just big chillin' in a bar in the nearby town. She confronts him, shooting him through the chest, but she ain't using God-Killer ammo, so it does practically nothing to him. Hank then grabs and takes her to a nearby alley to question her, where she reveals to him that she is Will's daughter. Saddened by this, he makes his way out onto the main street, as he hears the very thing he came to this town for, telling Charles to stay there. Hank then finds another one of his comrades, Danny, having just returned to town with a money bag stained with blood. Hank approaches Danny, reminding him of the oath they had all taken that day, and that he is here to make sure they keep that oath, when Charles steps between them, saying there is no proof Danny has done anything to deserve death. I mean, a big bag full of bloody money kinda says it all. It didn't get that way by itself. But Danny takes all ambiguity away, admitting to killing several traveling caravans when they wouldn't give him their treasure, bringing it back so the town would prosper. The fight ends pretty swiftly, with Hank being more than Danny can handle. Hank then remembers their time together, when they were both brothers in arms, before killing him. As Hank goes to leave, Charles asks him if he's going to kill any more of his comrades, and he tells her that they all took an oath that day, but refuses to say anything more. Charles decides that since her father died before she could learn anything, she will accompany Hank to see with her own eyes why her father had to die. Sometime later, Charles and Hank arrive at the town known as Rogue Hill, which has a massive fortress on one side of it. There, they meet up with everyone's favorite, Liza, who informs them that the one who created the massive fortress is an incarnate which takes the form of a minotaur, and that he continues to grow the fortress, tearing down parts of the city to do so. Charles then again tries to arc up at Hank, getting angry at him and asking him if he's going to kill the Minotaur as well. I mean, how hard would it be for either of them to tell her that all incarnates go insane? Just then, the Minotaur steps out onto its balcony and declares to the city that the time for war is nigh, and they must all prepare, unable to accept that the war is actually over, also indicating that this happens pretty much every day and is getting pretty serious. Liza then takes Charles to a refugee camp, where people who have lost their homes now live, due to the Minotaur's obsession with growing the fortress by any means necessary. Later that night, Hank and Charles enter the fortress, which seems like a poor decision on Charles' part, but anyway. They round a corner where they find a multitude of people who have died due to the booby traps set up around the fortress, and Hank comes in clutch, saving Charles after she accidentally triggers one of the traps. As they continue on, Hank reflects on how the Minotaur, Theodore Sherman, used to be when they first started fighting together, a complete coward and utterly terrified of death. Until Hank one day told him that he also feels the same way, but instead of freezing up, he does everything he can to prepare for battle, to mitigate his fear. This inspired Theo, and this method of building a fortress is his own way of preparing for battle. As Hank walks through the main building, a gate drops down and he manages to successfully ditch Charles, who he had no intention of taking any deeper. Just then, Liza, who had followed them in, comes to retrieve Charles like her and Hank had planned earlier, as if she was to go with him, she would most likely die. Charles, however, refuses to go with her, wanting to help Hank, and Liza folds, helping her to open the door. After navigating through the labyrinth, wow, the Minotaur made a labyrinth. How original. Hank finds Theo in the middle of a large open area, who is happy to see him, although Theo has become incredibly paranoid that there are enemies in the walls and behind every corner. Seeing that he's lost his mind completely, Hank has no other option but to tell Theo that he is the enemy that has come to kill him, and their battle begins. As their fighting grows, they fall through the floor onto the layer below, just as Charles and Liza arrive, seeing a knocked down Hank on the ground. Charles tries to tell them to stop fighting, again, and Liza tells her it's no use, as Theo has lost his mind long ago. Just as Theo brings his axe down, Hank catches it with his hands, and Liza explains that his incarnate form can only be revealed at night, as Hank transforms into a werewolf. As they fight, Theo yells at Hank, stating that his fears aren't ending, no matter how large he builds his fortress. And so, in a single strike with his claws, Hank ends the fight. Afterwards, as Hank stands over his once comrade's body, Theo tells him that since he knows he's going to die now, he doesn't feel scared anymore. He finally feels at peace, before Hank shoots him, stating that his friend can finally be at rest now. And this time, Charles doesn't call out for him to stop. We then cut to sometime later, with Hank and Charles on a train which has taken them into southern Patria, just as they approach a massive iron bridge, which now links the north and the south together as a symbol of peace, and is also essential for business and logistics. The train suddenly stops, and we see the reason is Liza, who makes her way onto the train and approaches Hank, telling him she needs him to come with her, as an incarnate known as the Behemoth is nearby. At a small camp, Liza explains to them that the Behemoth is heading east towards the Iron Bridge, and will most likely destroy it when it reaches it. We learn that the Behemoth was once a quiet, well-mannered man who went by the name of Artie, who loved to draw. His name was Artie, and he loved to draw. Yeah, no, that's just great. That's an inspired name right there. Later in the afternoon, the military act on a plan made by Hank to stop the behemoth. As they distract it with cannonball fire, relentlessly pummeling it, Hank sneaks around behind one of the joints in his legs which don't have reinforced armor plating, using his thunder spear-like weapon to take Artie down. Back at camp, Liza explains to Charles that the behemoth hasn't hurt anyone, as he has been actively avoiding populated areas, indicating that he seems to still have some humanity left. The next day, Charles walks up to him, trying to understand what it is he's searching for, but doesn't really get any answers. Shortly after, the railway president comes along, demanding to know why they haven't killed the behemoth yet, completely dismissing their plan of using dynamite to fill the valley to dissuade its path, instead saying they should use the dynamite to kill the beast. He leaves in anger when Hank says he's not changing the plan. That night, men from the railway somehow manage to knock out the trained and armed military guards, and try to blow up Artie, which doesn't exactly go to plan for them, as he gets sent into a rage and they get squished. A now unrestrained and angry Artie approaches the bridge. In his transformed state, Hank manages to slow him down somewhat, and pushes him into the side of the cliff that was laced with dynamite from their earlier plan, then activating a second batch of dynamite, which funnels all of the explosive power right into his chest, tearing it open completely. Even after suffering all of these injuries, Artie still pushes on, when another explosion goes off behind the bridge, and we see that all Artie ever wanted to see before dying was the ocean. As tears begin to fall down his face, he collapses just in front of the bridge, dying, having finally gotten his wish. Afterwards, we cut to Kane. Remember Kane? He shot Elaine, walking through the streets when he is approached by two women of the night. Being no simp though, he bites one of them on the neck, which then transforms her and she attacks her co-worker, biting her throat out. Just Sigma things, you know? The next day, Liza explains to Hank about how they've recently received news of an attack occurring in Whitechurch, the city of steam. She says that there was a man there who matched the exact description of Kane. Hank then begins to get furious, and Charles asks Hank who Liza is talking about, and Hank responds by explaining that Kane is the former deputy captain of the Incarnate Squad, and is the sole one responsible for unleashing these unrestrained incarnates upon the world. Some time passes, and they eventually reach Whitechurch. Liza explains that there is a massive coal mine underneath the city, and that this city is filled with merchants who are trying to get rich off of the coal. They then make their way to the spot where Kane was previously sighted, and Liza explains that he keeps on killing the citizens night after night, with over half of his attacks occurring in this very area. Liza wonders what it is he could be after, but Hank states that they first need to get some actual solid information on him. So, they begin to ask around, but no one is really seeming willing to open up to them, especially when they find out that they are military. As the day stretches on, Hank wants to continue his investigations, but Liza disagrees with this, suggesting that they take a break, and that she even knows a nice little restaurant they can go to. But Hank isn't really about any of that. Later that night, they eventually find somewhere to stay, and Charles enters Hank's room, wanting to ask him something. But Hank, like earlier, still isn't having any of it, and he rolls over. Elsewhere, on the foggy streets outside, we see a woman running from some kind of flying creature, and when she trips and falls over, because of course she does, she lets out a scream, and we can see a kid nearby having heard it, who goes to look, and he then sees the creature kill the woman in the middle of the street. Back at the inn, Charles, feeling bad about ruining his outfit when they first met by shooting him, begins to sew up the bullet hole on his outfit. This does, however, wake Hank up, but he seems okay with it. Charles explains how she is really good at sewing because she had to do it at the orphanage for all of the other kids, and Hank says that he also grew up in an orphanage, but he didn't really fit in too well. We then get a flashback to Hank's childhood in the orphanage, and we can see Elaine doing the exact same thing which Charles is doing right now. Back to the present, Hank tells Charles that she reminds him of someone, and to be honest, they do look very similar. Charles then asks him if the person she reminds him of is Elaine, saying that once when he was having a nightmare, she overheard that name. Hank tells her that she died, and was killed by the very person they are hunting right now, Kane. And it finally clicks into place for Charles, as she realizes why Hank has such a revenge boner for Kane. He then goes on to explain everything to her, that all incarnates eventually lose their soul and humanity, so Elaine was trying her best in her own way to save them. But Kane then killed her and released all incarnates into the world. Hank says that he doesn't know why Kane did this, but it's now his duty as squad captain to fulfill the oath they made. The next day, they make their way to the location of the new victim from the previous night, with Liza explaining that the victim's wounds and injuries are similar to those others who were murdered recently. Hank then deduces that due to the nature of these wounds and injuries, these attacks couldn't be from Kane. Just then, the same kid from the previous night, who is referred to as Andy, rocks up, telling everyone that a demon gargoyle statue was the one that killed this woman. The guards then try to push Andy along, but he doubles down, saying that he's telling the truth. Hank then walks up to Andy and asks if he saw it happen. Andy then leads the group to where he saw the gargoyle go into, which was apparently a large abandoned church. Charles then asks Hank if he's sure it's an incarnate, and Hank explains that it's the incarnate gargoyle, whose name is Topher, a man which he states had a stronger sense of justice than anyone he ever knew. We then get a small flashback and see, dude seems pretty rock hard about justice. We then get some fan service moments, which kinda seem out of place from the rest of the show, which lead to Andy running away from the group. Charles then goes off to try and find him, and Liza explains to Hank how she has to be going now, as she's received orders that she is needed elsewhere. Charles then locates Andy, just wanting to make sure that he's safe. But he doesn't really want anything to do with her or the military. She then asks if his family's home is close by, to which Andy doesn't respond to. Charles then begins to explain the situation that she is in, how she still hates Hank for killing her father, even though she knows her father was an incarnate, but she needs to know why her father had to die. She explains that as she continues to find out more about the incarnates, she is realizing more and more that they're not gods or beasts, and instead, deep down, they're just humans. Andy then walks away and steals an apple from a stall. Being the pure-hearted person that she is, Charles runs over to try and get him to put it back, when she accidentally pulls up his sleeve and reveals massive scar tissue underneath. Andy then explains that his mother was killed by the gargoyle, and he was also hurt in the attack. He says that the gargoyle is no human, and is just a beast. Just then, we hear a voice explaining that it saw the crime that he just committed, and we see a rocky creature land somewhere above them, which is the gargoyle. It tells Andy to repent, and that the time of judgment is upon them, and that the punishment for the massive crime he committed of stealing an apple will only be paid for with his life. Charles then aims her gat at the gargoyle, which asks her if she is indeed protecting this criminal. Charles then asks it why it is killing people, and it responds by saying that it is punishing them as well as saving them, by freeing their souls which are soiled by sin. Charles then tries the whole, remember who you are, this isn't you, you're being influenced by the incarnate type beat, which is completely ineffective against the gargoyle, who begins to fly down and attack. While this is happening, Charles is unable to pull the trigger, as she can't shoot something that she doesn't truly hate. Just as the gargoyle is about to connect with them, Hank comes in clutch, bashing it out of the way. They then have a small fight, where Hank manages to get a shot off, glancing its wing, but it gets a good hit on his stomach. It then lands up above, and asks if Hank has come here to kill it. And when Hank states that he has, it calls him a sinner too, saying that he accepts his challenge and will be waiting in the church for him whenever he pleases, before then flying off. Later that night, we see Topher overlooking the city, talking to himself about how filthy it is, when Kane suddenly appears behind him, reminding Topher that he now has the strength to make this filthy city that he despises disappear for good if he so wishes. Topher then says that it doesn't matter how many times Kane comes to visit him, his answer will still be the same, and he will continue to see justice served in the city. Kane then says that he actually came here for a different reason this time, placing a God-killer bullet on the table near him, explaining its special properties before leaving. Back at the inn, Hank tells Andy and Charles that he is going to fight Topher now, and if he isn't back before dawn, they must leave the city. He then walks up to outside of the church and makes his way inside. Inside, the moonlight begins to shine bright and illuminate the interior, allowing Hank to see the various corpses Topher has strewn inside the church. Topher explains that he wants to show Hank the justice that has been served under his careful watch. Hank then attacks the gargoyle, but turns out that's bait. As the fake gargoyle shatters to pieces, Topher flies down from behind and lands a solid hit on Hank. Back at the inn, we see Charles lying in bed when she gets up and notices her rifle is missing, and she then realizes that Andy has taken it. Back at the church, after taking the hit and being slammed into a wall, Hank is forced to transform into his incarnate state, and their fight continues. While fighting, Hank accuses Topher of having no justice, and we then get a flashback of Topher claiming otherwise. He states that due to the ceasefire, there was no justice served in the way the war ended, claiming that the villains from the south are still breathing. As we cut back to the fight, Hank manages to get the upper hand, but he didn't quite anticipate the blicky with the Godkiller round, which Topher had on himself. Somehow. Yeah, it doesn't quite look like there's any room for pockets on this man, if you know what I'm saying. The effects of the bullet then begin to take place, forcing Hank back into his human form, and Topher grabs Hank by the head, pulling him up, telling him that his time for judgment has finally come. He then begins to give a speech on how incarnates are the next step in human evolution, and they are the ones that deserve to live and lead. Hank then replies by saying that without their humanity, they are nothing more than beasts. Andy then shows up in the church behind Topher, pointing the rifle at him, claiming revenge for his mother while shooting. And he straight up misses. Your mother would not be proud, little bro. Topher then kicks him aside and Charles arrives, rushing over to him. Topher begins to march over to them, stating how he is the new justice of the world, and we see Hank pull the Godkiller round out of his side, allowing him to regain his incarnate powers, transforming mid-charge and shoving his fist right through Topher's chest, breaking through a wall and bringing them outside. Topher's last words are telling his captain that he has no justice, which Hank responds to by saying that he knows. Hank then pulls the trigger. Charles then runs out the back of the church and sees what Hank has done, beginning to tear up while asking why it has to be this way. Hank responds by saying their incarnate forms are just too much for one person. Hank then begins to collapse from the bullet wound in his side, and Charles rushes over towards him. As she does though, tendrils of silk begin to lock her down and make her unable to move. And behind, from the shadows, walks in Kane, accompanied by an unknown young girl. Rage begins to build inside Hank, but there's nothing he can do due to pushing himself too far in the previous fight. And we see a woman spider incarnate by the name of Elizabeth knock Charles out and take her. Kane then states that he's here right now to offer Hank an invitation to something, stating that the location to it is on the inside of this envelope, and that so long as he just shows up, he promises to give Charles back to him. Hank then passes out, due to fatigue from the fight. While unconscious, Hank relives the experience of Elaine being shot by Kane, before waking up in a bed. Confused as to where he is, he looks over and sees Charles' gun leaning on the wall, and it all starts coming back to him. Andy opens the door and makes his way into the room, asking Hank if he's alright, which Hank replies, saying he is. Andy then begins to ask about who the people were that captured Charles, wondering if they were working with the monster from the church. Hank then tries to reassure him, telling him not to worry and that he will save Charles. We then cut to a royal-looking estate where Charles is being held. We see that she is tied to a chair with a young girl analyzing her. We can see that Charles is struggling against her bonds hard enough to make her wrists bleed, but the young girl thinks that that looks like a tasty snack and gives it a go. But she decides it's not quite a flavor she likes. Charles then asks the young girl if she is always with Kane, and the young girl responds by saying that she has a name, telling Charles that her name is Migliglia, which is super fucking hard to pronounce, so I am calling her Mig. Charles then tries to ask her questions, but Mig is super ADHD and gets distracted by her blue eyes, calling them pretty and ignoring everything else Charles says. The door to the room then opens up, and we see that gross spider bitch from earlier creepily walk through. She goes up to Charles and tells her that she doesn't need to be scared, stating that she's not going to eat her. She then cuts Charles' bonds free, while asking her if she really was traveling with Hank, wanting to know why. Charles then explains how her father was an incarnate, and gives her full name, and the spider bitch pieces it together, understanding that she knew her father. She then asks Charles why she is traveling with the man that killed her father, but Charles ignores that, and asks her why she's been kidnapped. The spider bitch explains that she is simply bait to try and lure Hank here, but Charles is confused, and asks why they would go through all the effort just to try and lure Hank here. Spider bitch playfully says that she doesn't know, and Charles answers her question of earlier by saying that she is just following him around because she wants to, explaining that there's no reason for Hank to come and save her. The spider bitch then reaches out a creepy spider hand and ruins Charles' clothes before grabbing her face, saying that she doesn't need to worry. They'll make sure she sees the captain real soon. Elsewhere, we see Liza standing over the gargoyle's dead body with a bunch of people nearby. She says that he was most likely killed by a bunch of the citizens who resented him, rising up to take matters into their own hands, only coming to this conclusion because they can't see Hank around anywhere to take credit for it. We are then taken to another building, where a number of torn up corpses are lying on tables, and it's explained that these are the victims of the gargoyle. Another victim, however, is covered, and after being uncovered, is revealed to be someone who they believe wasn't killed by the gargoyle, stating that he was one of the most wealthy men in town. and they've simply concluded that he was killed by a feral animal of some sort. This guy Claude then asks if there's any other victims similar to this, and is taken to the wealthy man's wife, who was found around the same time, but they didn't notice any wounds on her body. He then moves her hair out of the way and sees 2 fang bite marks on her neck, before stating that he's finally found Cain. He explains that this woman must have been taken under control by Cain, was forced to kill her husband, and then died shortly after. Claude, who is the leader here, orders Liza to gather their troops and prepare for battle immediately, saying that Cain will be at the location of this deceased couple's estate. Elsewhere, sometime later, night has fallen, and we see Hank in front of the estate with the invitation in hand. He makes his way into the estate, and we see that all of the fellow guests are a bit nervous at his appearance here, with one of them even walking up to Hank, telling him that he should dress a bit nicer for events like this. A door then opens and the guests begin to give a gentle golf clap as we see up above Cain walk into scene, with Hank beginning to get mad. Cain then begins to give a speech, thanking them all for attending tonight's events. He says that all attending have a very open-minded view of the world and agree with his ideals, but explains that most people in the country are not as open as they are, explaining that the commoners are blinded by this small piece and don't even see how they're playing into big government's hands. He says that they must never forget the war, which began in the first place due to the North not wanting to share in the profits from Somnium, forcing the South to enter trade agreements with other countries, which the North didn't like, and then began attacking them, causing the economy to collapse. He then kinda carries on, trying to get all those in the room angry at the way they've been treated since the peace treaty was established, which works pretty successfully. He then says that they need a new order in place to tear down the current established government in order to open the eyes of the masses. He says that his ideals are finally about to be realized thanks to the contributions of those in the room. And then, a group of brand new looking incarnates walk out into the grand hall, and Cain says that they will use this newfound power to reclaim what has been taken from them, continuing the war, and finally securing their victory. A rich, wealthy dude then walks up to one of the incarnates, starstruck at how powerful they look, when he is f***ing obliterated, to the shock of all guests in the room. After a few seconds of silence, Cain states that their usefulness, unfortunately, has now run out, and the incarnates go wild, beginning to kill all of the rich members in the room. Hank then kinda lets this go on for a little bit too long, before actually kicking into action, and all of the incarnates turn their attention towards him. Cain then states that Elaine had told them that eventually all incarnates lose their humanity, and that they had to die, but he heavily questions that, before asking if Hank thinks the same. Cain then rambles on a bit, complaining to Hank about how they were treated as incarnates, and how they should be in power instead of humans, and how their soul is still there no matter what they do. But Hank points his spear towards Cain, ridiculing his ideas. We then get some tense moments with Hank surrounded by the incarnates, when suddenly men start rappelling in through the windows and Claude comes in through the front door, and it turns out that the incarnates are now the ones surrounded. Claude then orders his men to commence the attack, and using this very specialized set of gear, which all of Claude's men have, they kinda put in work, and it looks like they're pretty effective at taking out these incarnates. As Cain watches on, Claude runs up next to him, and Cain comments on the fact that his foolish younger brother has come to try and stop him. Claude then says, "Nah bro, I've come here to kill you." A small flying incarnate then flies down, attacking Claude, but he dodges out of the way before lighting it up. 2 more incarnates, however, then appear out of nowhere and begin to attack him, with the werewolf-looking one almost taking him out. But he uses the little flying incarnate he just killed as a cushion to block most of the attack, but he is sent flying as a result. On the ground, another incarnate seems like it's going to finish him off, but Hank attacks it, saving him. Claude's boys then gather around him, providing support, and Hank focuses his attention onto his main target, Cain. He begins running to him, but the werewolf and centaur incarnates try to slow him down. Look at this goofy f***ing face, by the way. Hank then fights with them briefly. Cain then begins to egg Hank on, telling him that he needs to fight freely, and the way he truly wants to. Cain then suddenly gets a massive chunk of his torso shot out by Claude down below, and seeing his opportunity, Hank jumps up towards Cain, throwing his spear right into his head, before pulling the explosive attached, blowing him up. There is then stunned silence around the room, and after the smoke clears, we see just a pair of legs. But we all know things can't just be that easy, and from a red mist, Kane's body begins to get reassembled. Kane then offers Hank one last chance to join him and be comrades once again, which Hank of course refuses. Kane then says that he is now left with no choice, and the spider bitch jumps down, bringing Charles with her. Kane says that he is now going to take away everything that is tying Hank down, pulling out a gat and aiming it at Charles. Hank begins to run over to him, but is pinned by the goofy werewolf. Needing to reach Charles, Hank then transforms into his incarnate state and breaks free. However, he is caught by the spider bitch's webs and can do nothing but watch as Kane shoots Charles in the side. Hank's mind then begins racing, playing back Elaine being shot, overlapping with Charles falling to the ground, and his heartbeat begins to accelerate. He then begins to snap, letting out a roar while beginning to grow in size. Kane then gives a small speech, telling Hank to become his true form once again, to become Fenrir, the Norse monster. We see Hank transform into an enormous wolf beast, and for some fucking reason, instead of attacking the cause of his anger, Kane, Hank, in a rage, leaves the palace altogether and makes his way to the nearby city. We then cut to the next morning, with Liza standing over Claude, who is slowly waking up in a medical tent. She tells him that he sure is lucky, and as Claude looks around, he sees other members of his team being in pretty bad states. They then walk outside, and we get a glimpse of the destruction that Hank in his Fenrir state brought onto the city. Liza informs us that Hank disappeared off to somewhere, and so did Kane. Liza then turns around and sees Charles being carried on a stretcher and runs over to her. And we see that the shot in her side is not looking good. Some time passes and we see the people of the city cleaning up rubble and refuse, with Charles seeming to have recovered alright. We then get a voiceover from Liza, explaining that the news of Whitechurch being devastated quickly spread around, and shook the citizens as much as the events from the previous war had. But then, 2 weeks after the incident at Whitechurch, another major event occurred, which would shake the world. We then cut to Kane, giving a speech to a large group of people, saying that there was once a time where the north and south of Patria fought divided, but even after the war ended, nothing changed. The filthy rich are still filthy rich, and the incompetent and corrupt nobles are still corrupt and incompetent. He says that the old rulers are suffocating the country, and making everybody else suffer for it, telling all listeners that now is the time to rise up, to overcome the border between the north and the south, making one true united Patria. And, with the help of the incarnates making this happen, he declares, very creatively, that this is the birth of new Patria. Liza then again voices over, telling us that together with the soldiers, citizens, and nobles who are unsatisfied with the way in which the war ended in the first place, Kane established the independent state of New Patria in the west. And it began to grow as one city after another decided to align with them and their views. Meanwhile, the government of the Northern Union of Patria, still recovering from the wounds inflicted from the previous conflict, decides to prepare their defenses for what they see as another war. With fear growing amongst them that the remaining incarnates in the north would join the Western forces, they decide the best course of action would be to destroy any incarnates left remaining in their land. We then cut to night somewhere in a forest, with a man walking, complaining about the cold, when he hears a massive rumbling, and we see a dragon reflected in his eyes, which looks vaguely familiar. Elsewhere, during the day, we see Charles return home finally, after 6 months of being away, with some strange reactions being given from the townsfolk. As she makes her way just outside of her home, she begins to think about how she never thought that she would ever be able to come back here, and she thinks back to the shot that she thought would have killed her. She explains that the dress she was wearing at the time was apparently made with a special cloth, woven from spider bitch's threads. She says that she doesn't know why she was made to wear that dress, but afterwards she was interrogated thoroughly by the military. We then find out that the military had completely stripped Hank of his rank after what he did at Whitechurch, and they are currently still searching for him. Hey boys, I'm gonna keep this short and sweet. YouTube pays like dog shit, and makes me edit videos in ways to avoid copyright that are unsatisfactory and also dog shit. Even though everything I do here is under fair use, that shit doesn't really exist in Japan. Go figure. So, I've started a Patreon. If you'd like early access to videos, videos edited in the way that I originally wanted them, videos that won't be taken down and removed forever, and the ability to vote on animes you want to see covered in the future, check it out. It's the single best way you can support me and this kind of content going forward if you like what I do on the channel. Now back to it. We then cut back to the present, with Charles placing flowers on the grave of her father. She then kind of explains everything she's done up to this point to the gravestone, and caps it off by saying that she doesn't know what she's gonna do now. We then then cut back to the village, with the citizens in a bit of a panic. And as Charles makes her way down into the town center, we see that conveniently, for plot purposes, Liza and Claude are here hunting an incarnate, presumably the dragon-looking one we saw just before. Liza is surprised to see Charles here, and Charles explains that this is her hometown. Liza explains what they're doing here in the town, and Charles overhears a conversation that Claude is having and asks to join in on their hunt of the incarnate hiding in the mountains. Claude then remembers that she was the girl traveling with Hank. Liza then covers for Charles, saying that she asked her to be their guide, as she is knowledgeable about the area, due to the fact that she grew up around here. And if they do happen to come across an incarnate, due to her experience with them, she won't run off screaming. Claude then agrees with this and lets her join. They then spend the day searching around, before we cut to them at night, with Claude offering Charles a drink. After a few moments of silence, Claude then apologizes for not being able to prevent her from getting shot on that night. He says that despite the casualties, he is glad that she survived that hellish scene. We then get another fan-servicey moment with Liza teasing Claude, lucky bastard, which I mean works for some people, but for me, it kind of feels out of place and takes away from the tone of the show. I mean, whatever sells, right? Afterwards, we do get some information though. We find out that he has risen to the rank of Major, is the son of the president, and is super serious about his job. The area then begins to shake, and they run over to whatever caused it. As it gets closer though, they stop, and before them, to the shock of Charles, is the incarnate form of her father. She runs up, beginning to ask what he's doing here, and Claude manages to only just save her from it using its tail to attack her, and we then see parts of its body beginning to fall off, showing that it seems to be deteriorating at a quick rate. We then hear this dude Gerald tell his men to open fire, and as they do, their bullets seem to have little to no effect. The incarnate then walks off, with the men about to chase after it, but Claude orders them not to chase, as they won't be able to finish it off in their current state. Back at the camp, we then hear Liza state that the incarnate really is Charles' father. She says that her report states that he was shot and killed, with his corpse being buried by the military. We then get, I'll be honest, a shit explanation as to how her father has come back to life, with Claude basically just saying that there are some incarnates with an incredible amount of life force, and its corpse must have somehow revitalized and started moving again. Personally, I'm enjoying this anime. However, this is dumb as fuck. Anyway, Claude then says they need to eliminate it at once before there are any more casualties. They then begin to carry out preparations, setting up traps, bombs, and Gatling guns in specific spots so they will have better odds in the fight. Charles, a bit stressed over the fact that her dad is going to have to die twice in front of her, is sitting off to the side looking at a photo of them all together. Liza then comes over and begins to ask her what kind of father he was, and Charles says that he was a very kind and gentle man, rarely if ever getting mad, and overall he was a good person. And even while hating the idea of violence, he joined the war effort so he could make sure Charles and the other kids could live happily in the future. Liza then tells her that she should head back to the town, and it would be in her best interests to stay away from here tonight. But Charles then says that she must face things without running away, no matter how difficult they are, knowing that that is what her father would do. Liza is then like, good shit, you passed the trick questions. Now for your reward. Here you go, some pristine God-killer bullets. She says that she doesn't know what will happen, so she will give them to her just in case. A short time then passes and we see the squad all posted up, getting ready for a fight. A scout then comes scooting back, being followed closely by the dragon, and the attack commences. They tie it up and begin barraging it with Gatling gun fire, but nothing really seems effective against it, and they dip out when the dragon begins to shoot a fireball out of its mouth towards them. It continues forward until it reaches another line of their traps, a bunch of explosives. And although it sets off every single one they planted, it manages to survive. It then opens its wings and begins to fly towards the nearby town, Charlestown. Claude's squad then begins to pursue it, telling Liza to go back to the town and tell the citizens to evacuate, and that they will slow it down. As they chase after it, their bullets seem to be ineffective, and Claude pulls out the junk jet he used on Kane previously, managing to blast one of its wings off. It then crashes into a field just outside of the town, and we see Liza and Charles on horseback make their way into the town, and begin to warn everyone to evacuate. Everyone, however, is like, damn girl, you know how early it is, right? Only moving into action when a part of the town gets blown up from the dragon. It then makes its way into the main section of the town as the villagers begin to run away. Charles, remembering what her father said about sometimes needing to pull the trigger on things that are necessary, runs up towards him. And finally, she begins to understand what Hank's mission was really about. It was about saving his men before they turned into monsters. With tears in her eyes, she starts to unload shot after shot of God-killer rounds onto her father, and he finally succumbs to his injuries. In his final moments, just like he did when he first got back to the village after the war, he places his giant claw-like hand near her shoulder, showing that there was some small trace of his humanity for his daughter left in there. With that, he closes his eyes, and for some reason crumbles away like he was made of rocks and not flesh and blood. Sometime later, in the morning, Liza brings Charles a drink and tries to cheer her up by giving her a hug. Lucky bastard. Charles then says that if there really is no other way for the incarnates to recover, and if their only salvation is death, then she really was completely wrong about Hank. She then goes over to Claude and asks to come with them on their journey in hopes of finding Hank, and Claude accepts.